Have you ever wondered why there are so many hungry people in wealthy nations like the US, Canada, and the UK long before and especially during COVID-19? This is happening even though the 1948 UN Declaration of Human Rights and the 1966 International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights recognize food as a fundamental human right. These agreements hold nation-states publicly accountable for the right to food. So what does the right to food mean and why does it matter? Welcome to Rights Not Charity. This podcast series is about a big idea, ensuring everyone has enough food, not as a charitable gift, but as a fundamental human right. I'm Audrey Tung, a PhD student at the University of Victoria. Today, two guests define the right to food and also to explain how it differs from food charities such as food banks and food pantries. University of British Columbia professor Graham Riches is the leading voice on the right to food in Canada. He is joined by attorney and PhD candidate Laura Castor-John-Violante, who researches the constitutionalization of the right to food. So let's begin. Graham, you were the first to make the connection between food banks and welfare cutbacks in Canada. You've also written extensively about the right to food, including in your most recent book, Food Bank Nations, Poverty, Corporate Charity, and the Right to Food.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I think I'd first say that it's crucial to understand that food is a basic human need, which is essential to life itself, to nutrition and to health. Food is a market-placed commodity as well, but at the root, a public good. It's critical to social and economic well-being, and in all cultures and in all religions, it's at the heart of family and community life. And yes, food is a fundamental human right. It's intrinsic to all human beings and to their human dignity. Now, we know the right to food is enshrined in the UDHR, as you've said, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And it's been ratified by close to 90% of UN member states, but sadly not by the USA. Now, the right to food is universally recognized under international law as foundational to the right to an adequate standard of living and to the continuous improvement of living conditions. And significantly, in 1999, the UN clarified its meaning, declaring the right to food is realized when every man, woman, and child, alone or in community, have physical and economic access at all times to adequate food or the means for its procurement. In other words, the right to food is about the right to feed oneself and one's family with dignity, either through growing, gathering, or hunting for food, or in our market economy, having money in your pocket to purchase the food of your choice in normal and customary ways.
Thank you, Graham, for pointing out that choice and autonomy are key components of the right to a dignified life. Now, can you also describe the difference between food as a charitable gift and food as a human right?
This is a key question. The right to food is not about charity. It's not about feeding the need and not about reliance on the happenstance of corporate food banking, redistributing leftover food, that's surplus food or wasted food, to left behind people. Of course, there's a moral imperative to feed hungry people, but charity is not a right. It cannot be claimed. It's highly stigmatizing, requiring people to beg for food. The problem is food banking has socially constructed hunger as a matter for charity. It thereby allows governments to neglect their public accountability, their obligations under international law to realize food security for all. Consequently, food insecurity has grown and further been entrenched by COVID-19. Access to food is not a food problem, but a matter for income security, addressing precarious work and interrupted earnings, inadequate incomes and social security benefits. And it's also profoundly a land rights issue.
Now, just as hunger is socially constructed, so are human rights. They're meaningless unless we normalize and institutionalize them, which leads to my next question. Laura, as an accomplished lawyer and academic with a background in human rights compliance, why does the right to food matter?
Thank you, Audrey. Well, the right to food matters because human rights matter. They make a difference. The right to food is ultimately a tool to tackle food insecurity with a rights-based approach. We need every single thing humanity has in its ingenuity arsenal to resolve massive challenges, food insecurity included. We need the certainty of science, the resolution of grassroots movements, the inspiration of arts, and we also need human rights because they function as guiding principles for more just societies, and they serve really as a limit to the abuse of power. There is a debate on the effectiveness of human rights, but when assessing human rights, it is important to have in mind that they tend to be compared with an ideal scenario, when in fact they should be more fairly compared with the existing scenario from before human rights were upheld. So even though human rights are not 100% effective, human rights are a strong, well-recognized institution, including the women's right to vote, the abolition of slavery, the declines of deaths in war and conflict, and the advancements of rights recognition for indigenous people, people with disabilities, and the LGBT community. Another argument that supports the right-based approach to solve food insecurity is the interrelated natures of human rights. There are different human rights that offer a most needed approach to resolve food insecurity. The human right to just and favorable conditions to work, the human right to social security, to health, to water and sanitation, to a healthy environment, just to mention some. Because of the interdependent nature of human rights, if one becomes stronger, then the other human right will benefit. If one is lessened, the other will deteriorate. By supporting the right to food, we are strengthening these rights, creating a ripple effect that would impact poverty, the health crisis, the environmental crisis, and everything in between. I would only add that in the meantime, we come with something better than the rule of law to organize us as a society, it would be irresponsible not to call on human rights to solve our Anthropocene challenges.
Thanks for highlighting the intersectionality and indivisibility of human rights, and also explaining how to harness their power to advance social justice issues. Now, considering vast social inequalities that have only widened during the pandemic, it's clear that there's still a lot of progress to be made. So how can the right to food be realized?
Well, Audrey, realization really implies awareness. So the first step is for every person to recognize that each of us possess the right to food, which is the main reason of this podcast, right? To spread the word. So the second step is to exercise our right to food. And here I want to come back to the notion of the right to food as a tool. As any tool, the right to food needs to be used, profusely exercised, monitored, and evaluated in order to assess if it's properly performing or if it has to be readjusted or even strengthened. In order to use the right to food, all of our efforts aiming to eradicate hunger and advance food security would need to recognize and embrace two fundamental aspects. Number one, right to food principles and priorities. These are equitable and non-discriminatory principles, gender sensitive with a focus on the most vulnerable and marginalized groups from indigenous, Black, Latin, Asian communities to migrant farm workers to low-income folks, etc., where people and planet come first, not profit or political gain. And the second one is that food is an entitlement and the state is the primary jury bearer. Food is not a favor, not a gesture of assistance that depends on goodwill or corporate agenda, a certainty rooted in the law and backed by the state apparatus. And with entitlements comes the beauty of accountability and access to remedy. The right to food gives us the legal grounds to demand public accountability when any branch of government is not protecting, respecting, and fulfilling the right to food. And to demand justice when the government or any entity, I'm looking to you, transnational businesses, are violating our right to food.
Thanks, Laura, for laying out what it means for food to be an entitlement. I appreciate that we must hold governments accountable when they violate the right to food, and that we must not blame people for their circumstances of poverty. I'm curious now, what can civil society do to uphold the right to food?
Civil society can and must support the right to food, and these human rights encompass procedural rights that precisely allow this. These are access to justice, but also participatory rights, in the decision-making process, which led to the virtuous cycle of empowerment, food literacy, etc. Acknowledging that we're not passive consumers of whatever the global food system imposed, but active participants, agents of change, really. And finally, transparency and access to information. This is why food insecurity data should be accessible, public, and disaggregated by gender, age, income, ethnicity, and the palette needed to better understand the complexities of food insecurity and to monitor and evaluate insecurity policies and programs.
I particularly like your point about participatory rights. So in this sense, human rights are not only legal mechanisms, but also a tool for collective action. Civil society arguably plays a crucial role in holding governments responsible for their human rights violations. For example, migrant workers, women, and Black, Indigenous, and people of color experience disproportionately higher rates of food insecurity. And this leads to my next question. How can we move towards making the right to food enforceable?
Audrey, let me first offer a definition of enforceability. So, enforceability can be understood as the capability to resolve a legal complaint within a legal system. Even though the right to food does not owe its existence to its legal recognition, the expression and protection of this right in national law is crucial to its realization, because the enforcement of the right to food in international law is complex and rather problematic. Entrenching the right to food in national constitutions and laws increases enforceability chances. Evidence shows us that the inclusion of social rights, the right to food being one of them, in constitution is translated into the strengthening of these rights because it allows them to be further developed through laws, policies, and court decisions. We also know that the entrenchment of social rights in constitutions, laws, and policies achieve social rights outcomes. They work. So far, 29 countries in the world have already included the right to food into their constitution. An increasing number of subnational entities have adhered to this trend. In the US, for example, Maine, West Virginia, and Washington have proposed amendments to their state constitutions to include the right to food. All over the world, legislatures are enacting right to food laws, administrations are implementing right to food policies, and courts are upholding the right to food. How can we move then towards making the right to food enforceable? Well, by demanding authorities to fulfill their responsibilities by taking all the steps necessary to guaranteeing a dignified access to healthy, fair, and sustainable food for all.
Thanks for raising the issue of constitutional recognition for social and economic rights, such as the right to food. That's so important. Now, Graham, what specifically can civil society do to advance the right to food?
It can actually assist in mobilizing human rights approaches to the access to food question by participating in the UN periodic reviews on economic, social, and cultural rights. Now, this is a process set up by the UN. Every 5 or 6 years, governments have to give an account to the UN of how they're addressing these rights. And one of the very interesting points I think should be made is that civil society is invited to participate in this process. The government draws up a list of issues and it circulates them to civil society organizations. I mean, it could include food banks, it could include a whole range of organizations, which then actually participate in listing their issues and having a conversation with the government and with the UN about what the pressing matters are. And there are 3 specific ways by which one can actually assess whether the right to food is being addressed, whether it's being respected, whether governments are taking away people's right to food or making it difficult for them to gain access to food by, for example, permitting legislative sub-poverty minimum wages or welfare benefits or denying benefits or social spending cutbacks. These would be noted as violations. And it could also be concerned with protecting the right to food, requiring governments to pass and enforce laws regulating non-state actors, for example, to observe food safety and actions which may actually restrict people's right to food in terms of protecting the food sovereignty of indigenous populations, which actually is a land rights matter. So again, it's about protecting against violations and it's about fulfilling, in other words, acting in full compliance. It's obliging governments as the primary duty bearer to take positive actions across employment, protecting workers' rights, living wages, adequate benefits, universal healthcare, social housing, etc. And also looking at the question of progressive taxation. These are all factors that are about complying with the right to food. And civil society has an active participatory role to play in this process for holding their governments to account.
Thank you, Graham. I really appreciate how you remind us that the right to food is something that needs to be insisted upon by civil society.
Just to add on of what Graham just mentioned, I have 4 words in my mind. Join, talk, write, and vote. Join one of the increasing number of civil societies that are advocating for the right to food. Talk and engage in right to food conversations. Approach your community, your local food bank, for example, and ask them about their position on the right to food and the burden that has been placed unjustly upon them. Write your representatives and urge them to prioritize the right to food, for example, to place poverty reduction at the core of food insecurity strategies, and vote accordingly. Search which political party is endorsing a rights-based approach to food insecurity and hunger, and in a few words, vehemently exercise your right to food.
Thank you, Lauren Graham, for showing us how to make the right to food bite, in Graham's words. If you're inspired by what you've heard today, please check out our other podcasts and keep up to date with the Global Solidarity Alliance for Food, Health, and Social Justice by visiting rightsnotcharity.org. The Alliance is an international research, education, and advocacy effort. You can find a transcript of today's discussion at rightsnotcharity.org/podcasts. This is Audrey Tung with Graham Riches and Laura Castor-John Violante.